Russia's defense ministry's released a video showing witnesses to the aftermath of an alleged chemical attack in Syria. Earlier, Russia's foreign minister said that Moscow has undeniable proof that the incident was staged.
We have undeniable evidence that this was yet another staged attack that involved intelligence agencies of one of the countries that is rushing to spearhead a Russophobic campaign.
More now from correspondent Daniel Hawkins. We've had a lot come in the past hour. Daniel, what's the detail?
Well, one event, two very different versions of it, Colin, essentially what's happened. Just to remind you, that incident on the 7th of April in Duma was claimed by groups on the ground in Syria, subsequently by France, the UK, US, to be a chemical attack by the Damascus government on civilians in the area, killing and injuring dozens, if not hundreds, of people. The Russian side has denied that. They've effectively said that the whole incident was staged, that it did not take place. Now, in terms of evidence, of course, again, we've got two very differing versions of events. Today, we had a statement by the Russian side from the Russian MOD claiming that they have found one of the witnesses who's on camera in that video, which we can see there of the incident in Duma, used as part of the evidence for that alleged chemical incident, saying that this medical student, this medical doctor who was in that video, has denied that the people there, the victims, were suffering symptoms of chemical poisoning, rather suffering symptoms of smoke inhalation. Let's take a quick listen to what he had to say.
My name is Khalil Ajish. I am a medical student. I work in the ER department of Duma's Central Hospital. On April 8th, a building in the city was bombed. The upper floors were destroyed, and the bottom floors caught fire. All the injured from that building were brought to our hospital. The residents from the upper floors were suffering from smoke inhalation. And that is what we treated them for, based on the symptoms they exhibited. During treatment, some person came in, I don't know who that was, and said that it was a chemical attack. People got scared. A fight broke out. Relatives of the victims started pouring water on one another. Others began to give inhalers for asthma to children, even though these people were not medical professionals. We did not see any patients exhibiting symptoms of chemical poisoning.
Well, that's the latest evidence from the Russian MOD, at least. It's important to remember, of course, evidence is the crux of the issue here. President Macron of France earlier stating they had solid evidence of this chemical attack by Damascus. The Russian side claiming their specialists have visited the site, which Syrian forces are in control now alongside their Russian support, claiming they have found no evidence of this chemical incident. Now, the OPCW team has deployed, they are, I believe, in Syria now. They will be examining the site over the next 48 hours, and they are the ones who will be able to provide more solid evidence as to what exactly happened there through analysis of soil samples, from air samples, looking at the victims who attended that hospital. They're the ones who will be able to prove what happened one way or the other, because right now we're getting two very different versions of what took place in Duma on the 7th of April.
Yeah, a lot resting on what the OPCW finds in the next 48 hours. For now, though, Dan Hawkins, thanks very much for that. Well, those who reported on the alleged attack in Duma originally have some question marks hanging over their credibility, as Murad Gazdiev explains.
Reports of a chemical attack first appeared, strangely enough, at almost the precise moment the battle had ended, when the Syrian government and rebels were negotiating on how to evacuate the latter. Reports first appeared on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and spread like wildfire.
Well, my colleague Ken Delaney and I have learned today that the U.S. now has blood and urine samples from some of the victims of this attack in Syria last weekend, and that those samples, according to U.S. officials, tested positive for chemicals.
Sources, the usuals: white helmets who serve as rescuers for Islamists and Syrian rebels. Also, the somewhat less known Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS, Together with the white helmets, they were cited by the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, virtually every Western media outlet reporting on this chemical attack.
On Saturday, April 7th, amidst continuous bombardment of residential neighborhoods in the city of Duma, more than 500 cases, the majority of whom are women and children, were brought to local medical centers with symptoms indicative of exposure to a chemical agent.
SAMS itself is funded by U.S. aid, $6 million in 2015. U.S. aid is widely believed to be an arm of the State Department and is banned in multiple countries, accused of interfering in domestic policies and promoting regime change. It even has an Office of Transition Initiatives. The management at SAMS are also, believe it or not, former USAID staffers. It was SAMS who reportedly provided the OPCW with samples of the alleged sarin gas that was used in Khan Sheikhoun, the site of a chemical attack last year. After which, Donald Trump sent 57 cruise missiles at the Syrian airbase. OPCW is on its way to Duma to investigate. We've contacted various groups, including the World Health Organization. They've cited SAMS, but have refused to go into any details. But for the US, there's already enough evidence.
We definitely have enough proof, but now we just have to be thoughtful in our action. The National Security Team is trying to give him as many options as we can, and we'll be thoughtful about it and see what happens.
What comes next, no one can say. Whether the US will go ahead with a preemptive strike or whether cooler heads will prevail.
We go live now to Lord West, who's the former First Sea Lord of Britain's Royal Navy. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this afternoon. The witness testimony from the video we've just seen from the Russian Ministry of Defense, which somewhat refutes the original video suggesting that people were being treated for a chemical attack there. Do you think that will be enough to take the heat out of the situation now?
Well, I think what's very important is that we get unequivocal evidence that there was a chemical attack by Assad's forces. And if we're not sure of that, then I think it would be rather foolhardy to make a response. If we find unequivocally that he has used chemical weapons against his own people, that is a clear breach of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and I think he deserves a slap. But at the moment, I personally have not seen definitive evidence. Probably I wouldn't see it, but I'm not at all sure that definitive evidence is there. Sort of speaking as a military man, I find it extraordinary that Assad's military are stupid enough to use chemical weapons in an area that they're just about to take charge of anyway. That seems to me extraordinary. Whereas if I was advising the opponents of Assad, I would very strongly suggest putting a barrel of chlorine gas and setting it off, because hopefully then the Allies would come and do something to Assad. So I am very nervous at the moment and would like to be sure absolutely that Assad has done this before any action is taken.
So what proof would that take then? Does it need to be the OPCW who are there at the moment? Because we're 48 hours in from the French president saying he's got irrefutable proof. We haven't seen any. We've only got his word for it.
Well, I was going to say I would hope that if he has got irrefutable proof, that he is able to give that to all of the countries involved, and then action can be taken. The OPCW will clearly help in this. In what's going on there. I think it's a messy situation at the moment. We need to be much clearer before we take action. And there's no doubt that both sides have done horrible things, but there are no good guys in this. Assad is a bit of a monster. The people he's fighting against are monsters. It's a civil war, and civil wars are merciless, bloody, and unpleasant.
You said you're troubled by the way things are panning out now. I know a lot of people are comparing this to what happened when Western forces started rolling towards Iraq, and like Sir Tony Blair convinced Parliament that there were weapons that weren't there in reality. Do you see any similarities with what happened in Iraq to what's happening in Syria today?
No, I don't. I mean, what is being talked of amongst the Americans, British, and French, and possibly some other allies, is very much a punitive air attack How large or small it is, I don't know, which is designed totally, assuming that he has used chemical weapons, to say this is not acceptable in the world we live in. This is what happens if you use chemical weapons. That is not the same as there's no invasion. There's no intention to get involved, I believe, in the actual civil war in Iraq, and I think in Syria, and I think it's very dangerous for any country to get involved in another country's civil war in that way.
But the short, sharp shock, for want of a better phrase, that was what was tried by President Trump last year, though, wasn't it, after what happened at Khan Sheikhoun? He sent those Tomahawk missiles in, took out a Syrian airbase, and depending on who you talk to about this, it did nothing, and we're at this stage today, or it's amplifying calls for people to go in harder, longer, and to more detrimental effect.
Well, I think what it did show was that it's not seen as an acceptable thing in our world, our globe of nations, for people to break a treaty of this type. And on the basis of evidence they had then, the Americans were certain that Assad had done that, and that's why they did it. And, one can argue about it should have been bigger or smaller or whatever, but it was important to put down the message that it is unacceptable to use chemical weapons. It's unacceptable. We've all signed a treaty. All the what I call the law-abiding and sensible nations in the globe have signed this treaty, and when someone breaks it, some action has to be taken. It's no good just talking about it.
True, but all sides are saying they also adhere to that. Do you think there's like an uneven weight in opinion here, though? Because if Syria or Russia says, here's some evidence, here's some proof, few seem to believe it. Of that. And yet, if someone tweets something, somebody from an aid organisation, someone tied to the Pentagon, all of a sudden it's true unquestionably. Isn't it slightly unevenly weighted when it comes to who provides proof and how that's then understood?
Well, you're saying this is received unquestionably. I mean, I can only speak for myself, and as I said, I am concerned about the certainty of the truth in this matter, because I think of it very much in terms of a military man. And it seems to me utterly ludicrous for a military that is actually just in the process of taking over an area because they've won, to go and do something with chemical weapons which will draw the wrath of a large enemy down upon them, because they don't need to do it. And that strikes me as extraordinary. Whereas as a military man, as I say, if I was advising the opponents of Assad, I would be delighted to actually kill a few people there. And let's face it, they don't care if they kill women and children there either, because that would have that effect. So I'm not willing to accept tweets. We need to see uncontrovertible truth about what's happened there, and then make a decision on that basis.
What about any military consequences? If there are any strikes, then it's a heavily guarded bit of airspace in that corner of the Mediterranean. If the reports are to be believed, there's a massive US flotilla on its way there now. It's getting very hot in the eastern Mediterranean right now. What would be the consequences if strikes began?
Well, I think if we make the assumption then that Assad actually has used chemical weapons, there will have to be some decision about what level and weight of attack is conducted. I would hope that through back channels, it certainly happened when I was Chief of Defence Intelligence, that one's talking with other countries there. So, for example, I regularly talked with Russia all the time when I was Chief of Defence Intelligence, and there will be links and talks, and there will be made perfectly clear that this is to teach a lesson because he used chemical weapons. And if that assumption's made, there will then be debates and discussions to make sure that nothing silly happens. But let's not kid ourselves. This is extremely dangerous. We've got a lot of countries involved in this country. There are a lot of forces involved there. There are a lot of assets there. Anything that happens is going to be extremely risky and needs a lot of cool heads, sensible talking, sensible debate to think about the way forward.
And we all hope that's happening behind the scenes. It's very different, of course, when leaders get cameras put in front of them or a smartphone where they can tweet off the bat. But in those channels of communication then that you talk about, do you think there will be enough cool heads in order to take the heat out of this? Or do you think some decisions are just going to be made snappily and without regard of the repercussions?
Well, I hope that the military, the senior military and senior diplomats involved will be sensible. There's no doubt that General Mattis is a very sensible chap. I knew him in Afghanistan. He's a very sensible fellow. And I've had dealings with senior Russians, and they can be sensible as well. So I would hope that there's very sensible dialogue going on. it's unfortunate we've got to this situation. I think the sad thing within Syria is that the best thing for the benighted Syrian people is that the civil war ends as soon as possible. It now looks as though it will end with Assad being still in charge of it, but it's important that it ends. As long as the civil war goes on, more and more people are displaced and killed. And it's important it ends, and I'm afraid any of this action that's going on at the moment is not going to make this civil war end any earlier.
No, because of course 7 years on, it doesn't feel like many conclusions are being drawn. Where does this leave the diplomacy then? I mean, it doesn't feel like a day goes by without the UN Security Council convening in New York. A lot of sniping across the table, especially between Russia, the UK and the United States. Does it feel like, in order to bring this drawn-out war to a conclusion, that the war hawks are going to get their way?
I think that none of the countries involved have been clever in their strategy with Syria. And I think we really need to think about this long and hard. I think the UN have a real problem in that if on the permanent members of the Security Council, if Russia continues to veto things all the time, it makes it very difficult to do things. But I think we need some cool heads. We need to sit back. We need to say, right, the civil war's got to end. Where are we going after that? How is this going to develop? And nobody must use it as a way of saying, aren't I a big clever boy? I'm on the world stage. That doesn't help anybody at all. We need to move forward in a sensible, balanced way.
Admiral Lord West, your insights really appreciated on this. It's been a very difficult couple of days and the developments are changing by the hour, but for now, the former First Sea Lord of Britain's Royal Navy, really appreciate your time. Thank you.